98% of the labor force in a movement needs to be volunteer or bivocational. And so if we're going to see healthy movements, we need to have a rhythm or a schedule that works for the bivocational leaders that we're training. So what we have found to be fruitful with our local teams is to ask for the bivocational leaders to commit to, at the beginning, 4 hours a week. We're asking of 2 hours to meet in a 3/3 training group, where they would go through the 411 and the commands of Christ, and then the long-term discipleship, usually starting in Mark. And this is typically done, bring your family. If you've got a family, bring the family. This is something that's done as a family. Typically meets in a home, includes a meal, and just a time of fellowship together. If you're able to start a church, then call it a training church. If it's not, if it's a training group, but just getting into that weekly time of 3/3. The second would be harvest time. So getting together, ideally with these same folks that you're in a 3/3 training group or church with, get together and go out in the harvest. Commit to go out in the harvest together. Either on a prayer walk, or the best one is the Luke 10 House of Peace search. Or being intentional to go after Oikos during that time, but just carving out time every week to engage the harvest. And then the evangelism will eventually turn into discipleship and church start. So you'll be getting trained and equipped in this, and then being able to lead others at this one. And then once you've got fruit that's multiplying, you need some more coaching. This is the time where we provide the, and this, by the way, this one here is with the family. Is a 2-hour time every week for just the leaders. And this is what we call Timothy training. And again, this is a 3/3 format, but instead of going through the commands or different things, we're using something called the 4 Fields Discovery, where we're looking at a specific chapter each week, starting with Mark 1 and then going Acts 13 to 20 and Luke 8 to 11, and just simply using the 4 fields to discover, all right, how did they enter? How did they share the gospel? How did they disciple? How did they form church? How did they equip leaders? And then asking a few other questions like, where do we see abiding and persecution, and what's the role of the Holy Spirit? And when do we see instances of no place left? But just using that to discover from the scripture, so week to week, month to month, we're seeing this process out of the Bible. We go from being pragmatists, where we're seeing it, to biblicists, where we're digging it out of the scriptures. And it's informing what we're doing and the decisions that we're making and how we're leading. This is also a good time to introduce the leadership tools that we find in the middle of the 4 fields. And I found it helpful just to introduce it as they need it. A lot of times the bivocational people can't make it to a 4-day training or travel to go to a mid-level, and so they need to get those tools as they're needed, like the 5 levels of leadership or precision harvest or practicing some of the other tools. Now this is also a time for more intense personal accountability on personal holiness, just asking hard questions of one another and how each other's doing in their walk and in their personal holiness and purity. And then it's also a time for them to ask questions. I mean, this is really it's a time with other leaders that they're going through difficult things together, and so they can be able to get some coaching and help overcome some of the challenges and learn from one another. And lastly, we use this 2-hour time to once a quarter we'll do an iron on iron, where they'll update their gen maps and we'll identify some stuckages. And so So this bivocational rhythm we found to be extremely helpful. That if you start off with, hey, commit to 2 hours for 3/3 and 2 hours for harvest, and then once they are seeing some fruit that's reproducing, then add the Timothy training time. This is passing downstream, and we're seeing an abundance of fruit in the harvest, 4th generation streams that have come out of bivocational workers. And it doesn't mean that they stay with just 4 to 6 hours. A lot of times it becomes who they are and they end up doing more. But this is a good place to start with bivocational leaders.